The letter arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, folded neatly in a crisp white envelope with the HOA logo stamped in blue across
These are
the
the
front.
final notices
At
regarding the
first,
lawn
I thought it
maintenance
was the usual
violations.
neighborhood
But
newsletter.
we just fixed that
Maybe
last
another
week.
reminder about lawn height
can't find
or
us again.
trash cans being visible from the street. I almost tossed it on the kitchen counter without opening it. Almost. Because inside that envelope was a notice saying I owed $10,000 in HOA fines. $10,000 for multiple violations. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion. Real, deep confusion. I stared at the paper like it was written in another language. According to the letter, I had broken rules about landscaping, property appearance, and unauthorized modifications. They gave me 14 days to pay before legal action would begin. Legal action against me. In my own neighborhood. The strange part, I hadn't changed anything about my property. Not recently. Not ever. My lawn was trimmed. My house looked exactly the same as it had for years. I followed the rules, sometimes even more carefully than my neighbors. So how could I suddenly owe 5 figures? I read the letter again and again. Then one sentence stopped me cold. Failure to comply may result in liens placed on all properties under your ownership within the community. All properties, not property. Properties. That word hit me like a lightning strike, because the HOA didn't seem to realize something very important, something that made this entire situation impossible. Or at least it should have been. You see, this neighborhood wasn't just where I lived. I built it. Years earlier, this land was empty. Just open fields and dirt roads stretching farther than you could see. I invested everything I had into turning it into a peaceful residential community. I designed the layout. I funded the development. I sold the houses, street by street, family by family. It became a thriving neighborhood full of life, kids playing outside, evening walks, and weekend barbecues. And yes, I created the HOA. At the time, it made sense. Homeowners wanted structure, property values, and a shared set of rules to keep the neighborhood beautiful. So I helped set it up, handed over control once the community was established and stepped away. Just another resident living quietly among everyone else. Or at least, that's what I thought. Until the HOA fined me $10,000. That's when a question started forming in my mind. A question that made my stomach twist the longer I thought about it. How could an HOA fine the person who originally owned the entire neighborhood? And more importantly, how had they forgotten? I picked up the phone to call the HOA office, fully expecting a simple mistake. What I got instead was silence, and then a response that made everything far worse. The woman on the phone sounded polite at first, the kind of rehearsed politeness you hear in customer service voices. Calm, careful, distant. HOA management, how can I help you? I explained the letter, trying to keep my tone light, like this was just a misunderstanding that would be cleared up in minutes. I even laughed a little while I talked, because the whole thing still felt ridiculous. I think there's been a mistake, I said. I just received a $10,000 HOA fine notice. There was a pause. I could hear typing on the other end. Name and address, please. I gave it to her. More typing. Longer pause this time. And then her voice changed. The warmth disappeared, replaced by something colder and more formal. Like a switch had flipped. Yes, sir. The violations are correct. My smile faded. Correct. I haven't changed anything on my property. The fines are not only for your primary residence, she replied. They apply to all properties under your ownership within the community. There was again that phrase, all properties. I felt my chest tighten. How many properties do you think I own? Another pause. Paper shuffling. Keyboard tapping. According to our records, 8. 8. My grip tightened on the phone. That number wasn't random. That was the exact number of unsold homes I'd held on to when the development was completed years ago. Investment properties I rented out quietly without making a big deal about it. Which meant the HOA hadn't forgotten everything. They just hadn't connected the dots. Can you tell me exactly what violations we're talking about? I asked. She started reading from a list, and the longer she talked, the more unreal it sounded. Grass exceeding approved height limits. Trash bins visible from a street. Exterior paint inconsistency. unauthorized landscaping changes, mailbox design violations. It sounded less like a neighborhood and more like a military inspection report. Every single violation came from different houses, different streets, different tenants. They weren't finding me for one property. They were stacking violations across 8 homes and combining them into one massive penalty. My penalty. I walked to the window while she talked, staring out at the quiet street. A kid rode past on a bicycle. A neighbor watered their plants. Everything looked peaceful, normal, safe. But suddenly it didn't feel that way anymore. How long have these violations been recorded? I asked. Several months, she said. Several months. So, no one contacted me before sending a $10,000 fine. We sent notices to the addresses of record. Addresses of record, which meant every warning had gone to the rental houses, not to me personally. Tenants who probably ignored them, or assumed they weren't important, or never even saw them. And now the HOA had skipped straight to punishment. I felt the first real wave of anger rise in my chest. Let me speak to the HOA board, I said. Another pause. They're very busy, she replied. But I can schedule you for the next monthly meeting. Next monthly meeting. For weeks away. 14 days until legal action. The math didn't work. So you're telling me, I said slowly, that I have 2 weeks to pay $10,000, but I can't even speak to the board for a month. Her voice softened slightly, but the script stayed the same. You may submit payment online to avoid escalation. Avoid escalation. The phrase echoed in my head long after the call ended. I set the phone down and just stood there in silence, staring at the letter on the kitchen counter. Something about this didn't feel like a mistake anymore. Mistakes get corrected. Apologies happen. Conversations open. This felt deliberate, and a memory surfaced that I hadn't thought about in years. A meeting room, a long table, and a group of homeowners who had once insisted they wanted more control over the neighborhood. Control I had willingly given up. Control that now seemed to be pointed directly at me. That's when a new question formed, one that felt heavier than the first. Had the HOA slowly turned into something I no longer recognized? Or worse, had they been waiting for a moment like this all along? I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, numbers kept circling in my head. 14 days, 8 houses, $10,000. It wasn't the money that kept me awake. It was the feeling that something bigger was moving underneath the surface, something I couldn't see yet. By morning, I decided to start with the simplest step, visit one of the rental properties myself. The first house sat on a quiet corner lot, the kind buyers used to fight over when the neighborhood was brand new. I remembered planting the tree in the front yard with my own hands. Back then it was barely taller than me. Now it stretched over the driveway, casting shade across the sidewalk. The grass did look a little long. Not wild. Not neglected. Just normal. The kind of lawn you'd expect from a busy family. I knocked on the door. A young couple answered, confused but friendly. They recognized my name from the lease paperwork, but had never met me in person. When I asked about HOA letters, their expressions changed instantly. Oh, those, the woman said. We thought they were spam. Spam. My stomach dropped. She disappeared inside and returned with a stack of unopened envelopes. The same white envelopes with the blue HOA logo. Dozens of them, rubber banded together like junk mail. We figured if it was important, someone would call, she said apologetically. Someone did call. Me. With a $10,000 bill. I forced a smile and told them not to worry. But as I walked back to my car, a new realization settled in. This wasn't just one property. If every tenant had done the same thing, the fines weren't accidental. They were inevitable. And somehow, the HOA had let them pile up quietly for months without ever reaching out to the actual owner. By the third house, a pattern emerged. Every tenant had the same story. Letters ignored. No phone calls. No personal contact. Just warnings stacking up silently, like dominoes waiting to fall. It didn't feel like enforcement. It felt like a trap. On the drive home, another memory surfaced, one I'd been pushing away since the phone call. The last HOA meeting I attended years ago. I hadn't planned to go. By then, I had stepped away from the developer role and wanted to blend in as a regular homeowner. But a neighbor had convinced me to attend just this once. I remembered the room clearly. The fluorescent lights, the folding chairs, the tension that filled the air before the meeting even started. A group of residents had stood up during the open discussion portion, frustrated and vocal. They wanted stricter rules, higher standards, more enforcement. They talked about property values and neighborhood image and protecting their investments. At the time, I understood their concerns. People had poured their savings into these homes. They wanted stability. But one comment had stuck with me long after the meeting ended. If we don't enforce the rules strictly, a man had said, some owners will take advantage of the rest of us. At the time, I thought he meant careless homeowners, negligent landlords, people who didn't care about the community. Now, sitting in my car years later, I realized something chilling. They might have meant me, because I was the only person who owned multiple homes in the neighborhood, the only landlord, the only one who didn't attend monthly meetings or socialize at community events. I had faded into the background by choice, thinking anonymity would make life easier. Instead, it might have turned me into the perfect villain. Back at home, I opened my laptop and logged into the HOA portal for the first time in years. Password reset, security verification, layers of digital distance between me and the organization I once helped create. When the dashboard finally loaded, my breath caught in my throat. Violation reports, photos, dates, notes, page after page after page. It was organized, detailed, meticulous. Every property had its own timeline. Every warning documented. Every fine calculated with precision. Someone had been watching these houses closely, very closely, and then I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. The inspection dates weren't random. They followed a pattern, a schedule, a deliberate, rotating cycle that covered only a specific group of homes at a time. I grabbed a notebook and started writing down addresses, cross-referencing them with my own records. The more I compared, the clearer it became. The inspections weren't happening across the whole neighborhood equally. They were concentrated, targeted, focused on a small cluster of homes. My homes. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding, because targeting requires intention. And intention means someone made a decision. The question was no longer whether the HOA had made a mistake. The question was who on the board knew exactly what they were doing and why. I printed everything, every violation notice, every inspection photo, every date and timestamp. By the time the printer stopped humming, the stack of papers looked more like a legal case file than HOA paperwork. Because that's what it had become, a case. I spread the pages across the dining table and stared at the pattern again. The inspection schedule circled my properties like clockwork, every 2 weeks, rotating from one rental house to the next. Not random checks, not complaint-driven visits, routine surveillance. And the strangest part, none of my neighbors had mentioned inspections. Not once. That meant one of two things. Either my houses were the only ones being watched this closely, or everyone else knew something I didn't. I decided to test that theory the same way most neighborhood mysteries are solved, by walking outside and pretending everything is normal. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the sidewalks as I walked down the street. Dogs barked behind fences. Sprinklers ticked rhythmically. It looked like the same peaceful community I'd spent years building. But now every house felt like it was watching me back. I stopped at my neighbor Daniel's driveway. He'd lived here almost as long as the neighborhood existed. Friendly, talkative, the unofficial source of community gossip. If something unusual was happening, Daniel would know. He greeted me with a smile and a wave. That smile faded the moment I mentioned the HOA fine. They finally got you, huh? He said. Finally. The word landed hard. What do you mean, finally? I asked. Daniel hesitated. You could see the moment he debated whether to keep talking. Then he glanced up and down the street before lowering his voice. They've been cracking down for a while now. New board took over last year. Everything changed. My chest tightened. Changed how? Inspections. Fees. New enforcement policies. They say it's about protecting property values. Property values. The same phrase from that meeting years ago. I tried to keep my voice steady. Everyone getting fined. Daniel shook his head slowly. Mostly rentals. The air felt heavier. They say landlords don't take care of properties like homeowners do, he continued. So the board voted for stricter oversight on investment homes. Stricter oversight. That was the polite version. What about warnings? I asked. Phone calls. Emails. Daniel gave a quiet laugh. This HOA doesn't call. They document. Document. The word echoed in my head as the pieces locked into place. Months of silent inspections. Letters sent to addresses where the owner didn't live. Fines building quietly until they became overwhelming. Not enforcement. Pressure. Who's on the board now? I asked. Daniel's expression shifted again, this time into something closer to discomfort. You really don't know. I shook my head. He exhaled slowly. It's mostly newer residents. People who moved in after the development was finished. That made sense. Leadership always evolves. But then he added the part that made my stomach drop. The president is Mark Reynolds. The name hit like a distant echo, suddenly turning loud. Mark Reynolds. I hadn't heard that name in years, but the memory snapped into focus instantly. A younger version of him standing at that HOA meeting long ago, speaking louder than anyone else in the room. If we don't enforce the rules strictly, some owners will take advantage of the rest of us. The same man, now the HOA president. A cold realization crept in. He hadn't just wanted stricter rules. He'd wanted control, and now he had it. Is there a meeting soon? I asked. Next week, Daniel said. Open session. Next week. 7 days. Half the time I had left before legal action. My pulse started racing. This was the first real chance to speak directly to the board, to confront them, to show the documents, to force a conversation they couldn't avoid. But as Daniel spoke again, urgency turned into dread. You should know, he said quietly, the board already discussed your properties last month. My heart skipped. They what? It was in the meeting minutes. Executive session. They didn't go into detail, but your name was mentioned. Executive session. Private discussion. Closed doors. Decisions made without the person involved. How long ago? I asked. Daniel checked his phone. About 5 weeks. 5 weeks. They had been discussing my properties before the fine even arrived. Before I knew anything was happening. Before I had a chance to respond. The timeline slammed together in my head like a door being locked. Inspection schedule. Stacked violations. Private board discussions. A massive fine with a short deadline. This wasn't sudden. It was planned. I thanked Daniel and walked home in silence, every step heavier than the last. The sun had started to set, casting long shadows across the street. Shadows that stretched toward my house like dark fingers. Inside, the printed documents still covered the table. Evidence of a story I hadn't asked to be part of. I sat down and opened the HOA portal again, scrolling deeper than before. Meeting minutes. Policy updates. Board announcements. Buried in a post from 6 months ago was a headline that made my breath catch. New enforcement initiative approved. I clicked it, and the first sentence made the room feel suddenly smaller. Beginning this year, the HOA will implement proactive compliance monitoring for non-owner-occupied properties. Non-owner-occupied properties. Rental homes. My homes. I scrolled further. Then I saw a date circled on the calendar in the corner of the page. The day the enforcement program officially began. The same week Mark Reynolds became HOA president. The meeting was in 7 days. The fine was due in 14. And for the first time, it hit me with full force. This wasn't about grass or mailboxes. This was about me. And in 1 week, I would be sitting in the same room as the man who started it all. I couldn't stop staring at the meeting minutes. Proactive compliance monitoring for non-owner-occupied properties. It sounded harmless, professional, responsible, the kind of sentence people skim past without thinking. But now every word felt loaded, because buried beneath that announcement was a link labeled supporting documents. I almost didn't click it. Almost. The file opened slowly, page by page, revealing a proposal drafted months before the enforcement program began. Charts, bullet points, cost estimates, legal notes. It was far more detailed than a simple policy update. This wasn't a reaction to complaints. It was a strategy. Halfway down the document, a section title made my pulse spike. Primary risk properties. Risk. The word sat on the screen like a warning sign. Below, it was a table of addresses. I recognized the first one immediately, then the second, then the third. By the fourth address, my hands were shaking. Every single property on the risk list belonged to me. Not rental homes in general. Not several landlords. Not community-wide compliance. Just mine. 8 addresses. Highlighted. Numbered. Prioritized. My stomach dropped as I scrolled further. Next to each property was a column labeled long-term goal. I expected words like improve compliance or increase communication. Instead, the phrase repeated again and again. Encourage ownership turnover. I read it 3 times before the meaning hit. Ownership turnover. They didn't just want the violations fixed. They wanted me gone. The room suddenly felt too quiet, too still, like the air had thickened around me. This wasn't about rules. It wasn't about lawns. It wasn't about mailboxes. The HOA board wanted the rental homes sold. They wanted the neighborhood to be entirely owner-occupied. And the fastest way to make that happen. Make being a landlord unbearable. A memory surfaced, something Daniel had said casually during our conversation. They say landlords don't take care of properties like homeowners do. At the time, it sounded like gossip. Now it sounded like a mission statement. I pushed my chair back and paced the room, the realization hitting in waves. For years, I've been proud of stepping back and letting the community run itself. I believed in giving homeowners control. I believed they would act in the best interest of the neighborhood. I never imagined I would become the obstacle they wanted to remove. My phone buzzed in my hand, snapping me out of the spiral. A new email. From the HOA. Subject line, updated balance notice. My chest tightened as I opened it. The number on the screen didn't make sense at first. $14,750. I blinked. Refreshed the page. Read it again. The fine had increased. Additional violations had been added that morning. They were still inspecting, still documenting, still building the case. The message ended with a single sentence. Failure to remit payment may result in lien proceedings against all applicable properties. Lien proceeding. That wasn't a warning anymore. That was a countdown. I sank onto the couch, trying to slow my breathing, when another notification appeared, this time from one of my tenants. A short message. Just want to let you know someone from the HOA came by today taking pictures of the house. They said the property might be facing legal action. Should we be worried? Legal action. They were already talking to tenants. The pressure wasn't just financial anymore. It was spreading outward into the lives of families who had nothing to do with this fight. I imagined them worrying about eviction, about stability, about whether their homes were about to disappear because of a battle they didn't even understand. That's when the moral weight hit me. Selling the houses would end the problem instantly. Pay the fines. List the properties. Walk away. Peace would return overnight. But 8 families lived in those homes. Kids rode bikes in those driveways. Parents built routines inside those walls. Lives were unfolding in spaces I once helped design. Walking away wouldn't just solve my problem. It would uproot theirs. Another email notification appeared. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was from a real estate agent. Subject line, off-market buyer inquiry. My heart pounded as I opened it. A client was interested in purchasing multiple properties in the neighborhood. Fast closing. Cash offer. Flexible terms. The message ended with a simple question. Would you consider selling your rental portfolio? I didn't need to ask who the buyer might be. The timing was too perfect. The pressure too precise. The strategy too clear. The HOA wasn't just pushing me to sell. Someone was waiting to buy. And the meeting with the board was only days away. The night before the HOA meeting, I printed one more document. Then another. Then another. By midnight, the dining table was buried again. Violation reports, inspection logs, meeting minutes, the risk properties proposal, the off-market buyer email, and the updated fine notice showing nearly $15,000 owed. It looked less like paperwork and more like evidence. Because that's what it was now. Evidence. For the first time since the letter arrived, I didn't feel confused or angry. I felt focused, calm in a way that only happens when fear turns into certainty. They wanted me in that meeting. They expected me to walk in defensive. Emotional. Desperate to negotiate. They had no idea what I was bringing with me. The HOA meeting room looked exactly the same as it had years ago. Folding chairs, fluorescent lights, a long table at the front of the room where the board members sat like a panel of judges. Residents filled the seats, whispering quietly, curious about the unusual turnout. Word had spread. When I walked in carrying a thick binder, conversations stopped mid-sentence. At the center of the table sat Mark Reynolds. Older now, more polished, but unmistakable. He greeted residents with confident nods, the kind of posture people adopt when they feel fully in control. When his eyes met mine, his smile tightened just slightly. He knew why I was there. The meeting began with routine agenda items: landscaping updates, community events, budget discussions. Minutes dragged by slowly, the tension in the room building like a storm waiting to break. Finally, Mark cleared his throat. "Next item," he said, glancing at the paper in front of him. "Outstanding compliance enforcement." The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Someone coughed. He didn't say my name. He didn't need to. I stood up before he finished the sentence. "I believe that item is about me." Every head in the room turned. Mark leaned back slightly, hands folded. "Calm. Controlled. You've received multiple notices," he said evenly. "The board has followed standard procedure." Standard procedure. I nodded slowly and opened the binder. "I'm glad you mentioned procedure." Paper slid across the table as I handed copies to each board member. The room filled with the soft rustling of pages. Inspection schedules. Property lists. The risk properties proposal. Silence spread as they read. I watched the moment recognition hit. One board member's eyes widened. Another flipped pages faster, searching for context that wasn't there. Then I placed the final document in front of Mark. The off-market buyer inquiry. "For months," I said, voice steady, "you inspected only my properties. Sent notices to addresses you knew weren't mine. Discussed my portfolio in private meetings. Increased fines without direct contact. And during all of this, someone prepared to buy my homes." The room buzzed with whispers. Mark didn't speak, so I did. "You weren't enforcing rules. You were engineering pressure." A resident in the back spoke up. "Is that true?" The room turned from spectators into witnesses. Mark finally leaned forward. "Our responsibility is protecting property values." The same sentence. Years later. Same conviction. But this time I was ready. "I agree," I said. "That's exactly why I'm here." I pulled out the last sheet of paper, the one I printed the night before. A copy of the neighborhood's original development documents. Signed years ago. Filed and forgotten. Until now. I never sold the HOA's developer rights. The words landed like thunder. Confusion spread across the board. Mark's confidence cracked for the first time. I continued. "When the community transitioned to homeowner leadership, I stepped away from daily involvement. But legally, the developer rights were never transferred, which means the original governing authority of this HOA still belongs to me." A stunned silence filled the room. One board member whispered, "That's not possible." I slid the signed document across the table. "It is." The power dynamic in the room flipped in an instant. Months of pressure collapsed into seconds of realization. All the fines, the enforcement initiative, the strategy to force a sale, built on the assumption that I was just another homeowner. Mark's voice came out quieter now. "Why didn't you say anything?" I looked around the room, at the residents, the families, the neighborhood I once built from empty land. "Because I wanted this community to run itself," I said. "I trusted you to protect it, not weaponize it." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Finally, I closed the binder. "I'm voiding the fines, ending the targeted enforcement policy, and transferring full developer rights to a neutral legal trust so no single person ever has this much power again." Relief rippled through the room like a wave. The fight was over, or so it seemed. As the meeting ended and residents began filing out, one of the board members approached me quietly. "There's something you should know," she said. She hesitated before speaking. "The buyer who contacted your agent wasn't the HOA." My stomach tightened. "Then who?" She swallowed. "Mark's company." For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. "Mark's company." She nodded. eyes flicking toward the parking lot where the last few residents were leaving. The tension from the meeting still hung in the air, but now it felt quieter, heavier in a different way. I didn't realize it at first, she continued. The offer came through a separate LLC. But after tonight, the pieces clicked. I stepped outside into the cool night air, the reality settling in slowly. The fight with the HOA had ended inside that meeting room, but the story itself had just shifted one final time. This had never been only about the HOA. It had been about ownership, control, opportunity. Mark hadn't just wanted stricter enforcement. He hadn't just wanted a neighborhood without rentals. He wanted the properties. My properties. 8 homes in a community where property values had quietly climbed year after year. The HOA fines, the inspections, the mounting pressure, the ticking deadline. It had all been part of the same funnel. Push the landlord until selling feels like relief. I leaned against my car and stared down the street. Porch lights glowed softly. Somewhere a dog barked. A kid laughed from inside a house. Life continued exactly as it had the night before. Peaceful, ordinary, unaware of how close it had come to being disrupted. 8 families slept inside those homes tonight. They had no idea how close their lives came to being uprooted by a strategy hidden behind paperwork and policy updates. And that realization didn't make me angry anymore. It made me tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The kind that comes after a long storm finally passes. Over the next few weeks, everything changed quietly. The HOA issued a community-wide statement announcing the removal of the targeted enforcement program. Violations across the neighborhood were reset and standardized. Communication policies were updated so homeowners would always be contacted directly before fines escalated. No drama, no accusations, just a careful, professional shift forward. Mark resigned from the board 2 days later. No speech, no explanation, just a short email thanking residents for the opportunity to serve the community. And the buyer inquiries stopped overnight. I met with my tenants one by one after that. Not to warn them, not to scare them, just to reassure them. Their homes were safe. One of them hugged me. Another laughed in relief. A couple invited me in for coffee and told me about the garden they planned to plant in spring. Small moments. Guide moments. The kind that reminded me why I built this neighborhood in the first place. For years, I had thought of the houses as investments. Numbers on spreadsheets. Long-term plans. But standing on those porches, listening to families talk about school drop-offs and weekend barbecues and future plans, the houses stopped feeling like properties. They felt like stories. And I realized something I hadn't understood before. Owning a neighborhood isn't about land or contracts or legal rights. It's about responsibility. The responsibility to build something that lasts beyond you. Something fair. Something stable. Something people can trust. I kept my promise from that meeting, too. The developer rights were transferred into a neutral legal trust, exactly as planned. No single homeowner, board member, or investor would ever hold that kind of silent leverage again. The power now belonged to the community itself, balanced, transparent, and shared. Exactly how it should have been from the start. Sometimes I still think about the envelope that arrived that quiet Tuesday morning. How close I came to paying the fine just to make the problem disappear. How easy it would have been to sell and walk away. How different everything would look today if I had. Instead, the neighborhood is still here. The same tree still shades the driveway. Kids still ride bikes down the same sidewalks I once sketched on blueprints years ago. Peace didn't come from winning a fight. It came from refusing to run from it. If there's one lesson this story leaves behind, it's this. Power without transparency creates problems, but silence lets them grow. So if you ever find yourself facing something that doesn't feel right, a decision, a system, a rule that quietly pushes people into corners, don't assume it's too complicated a challenge. Ask questions. Read the fine print. Speak up, because sometimes the biggest battles start with a single envelope and end with an entire community choosing fairness over fear. If this story made you think, share it with someone who believes in standing up for what's right. And remember, the moment you start asking questions is the moment things begin to change.